all of your classes, and of course, into the year graduation stuff. So hopefully you guys are well rested and ready to go. And let's go into the focus question. So how does a country go into an economic depression? This may be a question that you already know the answer to. So I'll open it up to you guys before you even do the do now. What got us into the Great Depression? Who remembers from 6th grade, or who knows? I think it's something that you guys might be a little bit familiar with. The stock market failed. The buying on margin, yeah. Buying on credit, same type of thing with the installment buying. All right. So yeah, you guys are already kind of on the right track. So we're going to kind of talk about those things. But let's go into the do now. Describe how the people were living during the Roaring '20s. This is a good review prior to us being in, prior to us getting into break. So maybe just talk about some things, describe some things, or just generally how are people living throughout the Roaring '20s. People were acting rich. In reality, they weren't. That's because of the buying on credit and buying on margin. What else? Good. People were partying like crazy. That's where they get the name the Roaring '20s from, because it was like one big party, so to speak. People were living in the moment, so to speak, and not necessarily thinking about their future. And in terms of all that, people are drinking, going to parties. Women, okay, women were also drinking, partying, but they also got some jobs and the 19th Amendment. All right, so yeah, a lot of alcohol, even though prohibition was a thing. So these was the build-up to the Great Depression. I think I've told you guys already, and I've often said that the 1920s were like a really big party. Everyone's having a great time, and then the 1930s are the hangover that comes right after, okay, which is obviously a side effect of alcohol. They're dancing like they're in a room without a roof. I don't know if you stole that from someone or if you just came up with that, but I love that, Liz Mel. They're dancing like they're in a room without a roof. Yeah, like eventually it's gonna rain, right? You know, it's like if you it's good for a while, but eventually it's gonna be. It's from a song. Okay, I guess I've not heard of it, but that's cool. Okay, so it's really not as many slides as I'm hyping up to be. There's about 3 or 4 slides. So let's start with the first one. What was the stock market crash? Please copy down what's in red. If you were in 6th grade and you answered the question, you know, what was the cause of the Great Depression, and you said the stock market crash, you probably get like a pat on the back and you say, you know, great job, that's awesome. That is kind of not really the truth. The stock market crash, not that you were being lied to, it's just you're getting a very small picture of what this actually was. So the stock market crash was known as the start of the Great Depression, but it's not necessarily the reason we went to the Great Depression. Please understand there's a huge difference. So what I mean is this was the event that started the Great Depression, where things started to unravel, but the stock market crashing really didn't affect too many people. All right, so we've gone over the stock market already. I'm not the best in explaining it. You know, you can definitely, you know, get some better advice if your family works as business people, or if their money's in stocks. But ultimately, people had their money in the stock market at the time. But it's not a large percentage of people. Like at the time in 1929, there was about 3% of people that had their money in stocks. Okay, now, if you had your money in the stock market at the time, and you put a good portion of your money, then yes, you lost a ton of money. All right, but is 3% a large portion of the population? No, that means 97% of the rest of the people are perfectly fine. All right, but it's what happens over the next couple of months and the next year or two is where it all kind of falls apart. All right, so let's kind of go through those things. The bigger issue started to be that the stock market became an area where people started to see, well, wait a second. If the stock market could crash and those people could lose their money, what's the next thing that can maybe crash? And the next logical thing to people was the banking system. Okay. So what ends up happening is the stock markets crash, and then there's this kind of weird phenomenon that starts to happen. The public starts to get very worried about banks. Okay. And this is the process of what starts happening. Guess what? People start taking their money out of banks because they don't trust it. When the financial institution of the stock market crashes and people lose their money, everyone has a friend who has money in stocks at the time, or they know someone who has money in stocks. So people get worried. They basically become under the idea that, hey, if the stock market could crash, maybe the banks can crash too. So a lot of people start taking their money out of banks. Now you may say, okay, why is that a big deal? That means people still have their money. Banks function from money. If there's no money in it and no one's basically putting their money into the banks, banks can't work. All right, so now let's start thinking about a couple of things. People want a car at the time. We know this from the Roaring 20s. People want a house. They need to get a loan. If the bank has no money to give out loans, they can't give out loans. Right? So people now started to find themselves in a situation where they couldn't get loans. All right. Now, if a bank can't give loans and if a bank doesn't have money in it, what does the bank do? The banks start to shut down. Okay. So it becomes this kind of tidal wave of problems that start to happen. Okay. So guess what? Now the banks are starting to realize that we need money because people are no longer keeping their money in the bank. They're taking the money out. So guess what they start to do? They start to ask people for the money they owe from the buying on margin, the buying on credit. And since we know that they really couldn't afford those nice cars and they really couldn't afford those nice clothes, guess what happens? No one's able to pay back the banks. So the banks close. So really the short answer is the stock market crash was not why the Great Depression happened. The stock market crash really comes down to these two reasons. Number one, banks loaned too much money to people installment buying, buying on credit and buying on margin, and people could not pay it back. There was too much debt. Okay. Number two, people pulled money out of the bank because of the lack of faith in the financial systems. Okay. The stock market crash is sometimes known as Black Tuesday. Ultimately, it just came to a point in time where the amount of debt that was owed from the buying on margin and speculation buying just became too much. So the market crashed. All right. And then from this, October 29th, all throughout 1930, a lot of banks start to close. A lot of people start to owe money and they can't pay it back. All right. And then it becomes this tidal wave of problems, as we kind of mentioned. When the banks start to close, now jobs have a tougher time hiring people. All right. So what happens to the unemployment rate? It starts to go way up. Okay. So when things like this happen, and they do, stock market doesn't do well for a while. Sometimes unemployment goes up. We know that when the pandemic hit, a lot of people went unemployed. We went from having the #1 economy maybe of all time in early 2020 to basically having a huge unemployment rate because of COVID. Okay, and all the businesses shutting down. All right, so let's go into this next slide, which is kind of important. All right. I'll give you a minute to copy it down, but we want to see how did things get worse after the crash. And we're going to look at the president at the time. His name's Herbert Hoover. And some of the mistakes his administration probably made that made things worse. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit. I'll give you a minute to copy this down. Again, just in red. Okay. So after you guys have read the first thing, many people saw others lose their money, so many people got scared and took all of their money out of the bank. We've kind of already alluded to this, but this is where peer pressure and public opinion becomes a huge issue. Because when your family or your friends start becoming worried about a situation, other people tend to follow. So this left the banks with no money, leading to the banks to collapse, which really made things worse. Okay. Now, let's go into President Herbert Hoover at the time. So he's known in some ways as one of the worst presidents in American history because when the Great Depression happens, he takes a kind of interesting stance in basically dealing with the Great Depression. So President Herbert Hoover believed that it was not the government's responsibility to intervene with the economy and give relief to people and create jobs. Now, that is otherwise known as what? What is not the government's responsibility to intervene. Okay, stay away. Hands off. Okay, and I have it written on the slide a bunch of different ways is laissez-faire. Okay? That was typical of the 1920s. And here's the thing, guys, it worked. The 1920s was a time of economic boom. Now, there was some financial problems they had, but the 1920s was a great time. Okay? So what happens here is Herbert Hoover is going to continue that. And basically, Herbert Hoover's thought was, this is a tough economic thing that happened in 1929 and 1930, but, you know, we will come out of it, so to speak. Capitalism will win sort of thing, and things will get better. Okay? He did not believe it was the government's responsibility to intervene, okay? Because prior to that, that's what was going on, and it was working. But now things get really, really bad. And he doesn't really do anything until maybe the last few months of his presidency where he really tries to fix it before his election. But it doesn't work at the time because it's almost like, you guys have ever heard of the term, I'm sure, too little, too late. By that time, by 1931, 1932, it's already so bad, the country is in basically like economic freefall. All right. So laissez-faire has its pros, has its cons, don't get me wrong. But ultimately, when things start to get really bad, okay, the government has to kind of step in, and he did it, okay? I often give this example, and maybe it's not the best thing. You know, if you're at PS 89 and you're walking through the hallway and you have a smile on your face and everything's good, you know, and I see you in the hallway, I might just leave and say hi, okay? No problem. You know, but if I'm walking down the hallway and you're hysterically crying and you're inconsolable and I just wave to you and say hi and I keep walking, it's maybe not the best thing. If someone's in need, it's maybe a good thing to maybe step in and help them out. America at this time doesn't really stop and try and help the people that are in need. All right, the country is essentially falling apart economically and no one's doing much about it. Okay, now I want you to think of how things went with COVID after it happened. I'm not saying that the way we handled COVID as a country was perfect, but there was an attempt by the government to try and fix the problem and help out people that were in need. So we know about the stimulus checks. We know how there were forgiveness on like student loans. There were things that were done to try and help people out that were in need. That is because in the Great Depression, they didn't do that. They did very little to help out, and things got dramatically worse. So with that being said, because no one steps up in the government and tries to help out the people in need, 20% of the country becomes unemployed. People become, I mean, just dirt poor, okay? Because when the banks close and people lose all of that money, they have no money, okay? It's a sad thing. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead, but when people take their money out of the banks, it was a scary thing for them because they realized if they lost their money in the bank, okay, or if the bank was robbed, then they lose their money forever. But it's different now. Does anyone know what happens if the bank was to lose Mr. Panio's money? Does anyone know what happens if the bank was to like lose my money? I could sue them. Yes. They take someone else's, kinda. Muhammad's kind of correct. The government insures it. What that means is the government will get you your money back. Okay, we'll learn about that when we learn about the New Deal, okay? But Neve is correct. They have to pay you back. Okay? So what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is they have to make sure that you get your money back. So now there's never a worry for me, because when the money's in the bank, I don't ever have to worry about losing it. Okay, because the government insures it and makes sure that I will get it back if, God forbid, there's a bank robbery or if the banks collapse, the government makes sure you get it back. In 1930, you lost it forever. Okay, and the third thing was obviously Hoovervilles were created. So we'll talk about that when you get to your assignment a little bit. Okay, so we're going to continue to look at Herbert Hoover and his presidency. I think we should do one more slide of notes, and then you could take about 10 minutes to start working on one of your assignments, and then we need to just finish up the last 5 minutes of class, something to help you with your period 2 assignment. All right? Another frowny face. You guys are very sad today. All right. Don't worry about Hoovervilles right now. I think you guys know this from 6th grade, but basically there were like these, I don't know if you can even call them homeless areas, but there were these areas where people were really struggling and couldn't afford rent. So they built up these kind of shanty towns in like parks. There's a very famous one in Central Park. This is kind of what they look like, but you have an assignment on that, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. I think it's pretty straightforward. And don't worry about that Regents question just yet. Okay, so let's look at these 2 questions first before we try and go further. Number 1, write in the chat, how does the government make money off its citizens? I think you guys already know this one, but let's just make sure we're on the same page. Okay, taxes. Okay, for the most part, the way the government makes money is off of sales tax and income tax. All right, and that money goes to the particular government. In the next couple of days, I think Wednesday, I'm actually going to show you my paycheck to show you exactly how taxes get taken out so you fully understand. Here's the problem. How does a country get their economy to grow? Meaning, how do you build up the government's money when people are in massive debt and struggling? How do you tax someone that is unemployed, right? How does the government make money? And the answer to that is known as deficit spending. This is something that we do a lot of, and it has its pros and has its cons, so let's kind of take a look at it. All right, so please write down this. Please write down this. Number 1, we should know that take taxes from people and people's income. That is the 16th Amendment. We know that's a huge way they go about it, but also let's look at what this deficit spending is. Yes. Okay, so I just had to pull up something else here. Sorry about that. All right. So deficit spending is this kind of complicated process where basically the country is going to raise money by borrowing from other countries. So in essence, you want to increase our country's debt, okay, but paying back these other countries later. So you can get loans from other countries like China or Russia or Britain and then pay them back over time. This is called deficit spending. Okay? And deficit spending is the way we try to basically grow money in our country's economy at the time. Okay? And this is something that really starts to take hold under the next president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. But what happens is it's a very, Milagros, you got it 100%. That's the dangerous slope. You get into more debt. The idea is that you get into more debt, but then, you know, you should make enough money and then you pay back the debt. Okay? So the idea of it's like, okay, we're going to go further into debt and go further into what's called the deficit. And if you're in a deficit in a game, you're losing. Okay? The thing is we need to go further into a deficit so we can build money and gain some more money off it. And here's the truth. And this may be a little bit, you know, some of you guys, this may go over your head a little bit, but a politician will never say, you know, we are going to raise your taxes. Because not many people are going to vote for a person that says we're going to make, you know, tax you more. But there's a usual correlation to this, guys, and I just want to be clear with this. If a government's going to provide more things, I know you guys have mentioned as a class you maybe want free college, right? Well, if you want free college, generally means that there's going to be taxes being risen. The more programs the government does, the more taxes that come with it. The only other way to maybe get, you know, something like this, okay, is instead of increasing taxes, you can increase the deficit or the debt. So if you want to pay for college for free and make it free for all people, you can maybe not tax people, but you can also deficit spend. So that's the other way to also go about it. So a lot of politicians, if they say they're not going to raise your taxes, this is what they're going to do. They're going to raise the debt. Okay? And this becomes a little bit of a tricky problem. Now, I'm going to show this to you, and it's going to be a little complicated first and a little overwhelming. But I want you just to kind of look at something here. So right here, I'm going to share with you, this is the U.S. debt clock in 1980. Okay, so it says on this day here in 1980. So in 1980, we owed $875 million. But it wasn't so bad because we brought in around $500 million in taxes. Okay? And then you had what's known as the income tax, and then the payroll tax and the corporate tax. And you don't have to add all of these together, guys, but when you put together a lot of these numbers, okay, it's going to end up being right around $875 million. Okay? So not so bad. The amount of tax money we're bringing in and the amount of money that we owe is pretty even. So that's good. Here's where we are in 2021. You ready? Let me zoom back a little bit. Actually, here. We owe right now $28 trillion. That's not a million. That's trillion dollars per year. That's the amount of money we owe. Every year, we bring in around 3 trillion, 4 trillion. We bring in about $5 trillion. So you don't need to be an algebra regent to say 28 trillion minus 5 trillion equals 23 trillion roughly we owe. So why I'm showing you this is being in a deficit is fine. We're in a big deficit right now, and I don't know what this means for the future. I'm a history teacher. I'm not a future teacher. But I will probably say this will come back and hurt us in some way because ultimately, look, if you owe a lot of money, just think logically. If you ask your friend for money and they loan you money and you don't pay them back and you ask them for money again, they're probably not going to give you money. So we keep asking countries for money. And it's like this weird thing because other countries ask us for money and then we ask them for money. It's like this whole complicated thing. Even I don't fully understand. But ultimately, you can see the amount of money that we owe. So deficit spending has its pros because it can help bring us out of economic troubles, which we are in. But the debt can be extremely, extremely challenging. The debt is getting higher and higher, but the amount to pay it off isn't as much as the debt. Yes. Right? If we were bringing in 28 trillion of tax dollars, then I guess it's not so bad, but we're not bringing in close to that. It's not an even amount. Is the price high because of inflation and how the worth? No, inflation has something to do with it. Yes, I should say yes. It has something to do with it. Like why, a sandwich used to cost, $1, now it costs $8. Yes, Shinari, there are other countries in debt to the U.S. But Maheen, ultimately, inflation is not the biggest issue here. If we decide to say, okay, to pay off this national debt, we want to print more money. So now we're printing more money. That would lead to probably inflation, okay, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. All right. But I wanted to show that to you so you get a kind of better understanding that, okay, it's fine to go into a deficit, but eventually you have to pay back this money. And if you can't pay back this money, that could lead to even further economic troubles. I'm not sure if that's easy enough to follow. Please write in the chat if you understand or if you need me to clarify. But if you can't tax their citizens, or if a politician says, we're not going to tax you higher, then they got to get the money from somewhere. All right. If you want free college, if you want free healthcare, I have no problem with that. And you shouldn't have a problem with that. But know the money has to come from somewhere. And if it's not going to come from tax dollars, it's going to come from money that doesn't exist. We're going to go into debt. And that's what's happening here. Now, a big reason why this debt is so high is because of COVID. Let me see if I could just go back 2 years. Let's go to 2016. 19 trillion. All right, so in 5 years, we gained $10 trillion in debt. That's a big reason because of COVID. And then we have stimulus packages where, like, Biden just passed a $1.6 trillion stimulus package, for paychecks for people and other things, right? I think you guys have followed the news. You followed it. That's fine. Debt's going up, though. Okay, the money has to come from somewhere. And if it's not coming from taxpayers, it comes into the debt. Okay, take a look at your clock right here. It's 10:50. So I want to give you guys to around 11:01, 11 minutes just to do this reading here. It's not exactly the toughest reading you've ever had. I think it's actually on a 7th grade level, but it's pretty good at just like kind of going over the basics of Hoovervilles. And then you have some, short answer, true, false things here that you can go along and do. Take 11 minutes to do that, and at the end of the period, we have to just go over something called the bonus army, which is going to set you up for your second period lesson. All right, let me know if you have any questions. I will be taking attendance. All right, take another 2-3 minutes. You may not finish, but you can finish it up a little later. It's going to be too difficult. Last minute, you could start to bring your attention to the Regents question. When you're ready, you can write it in the chat. And then we'll move on to what's going to be your second period assignment. Yeah, I think 3 is correct. I didn't explicitly go over this, but I think you can make that connection, right? During the Great Depression, he gets the blame for the Great Depression. This is a thing that typically happens. Whenever the politician gets a blame, they put their name in the front of it. I'm drawing a blank for other examples right now, but like this happens a bunch. You guys can think of one. I want to write one in the chat, but they did a bunch with Trump. They did a bunch with Obama. They did a bunch with Bush. It's a very typical thing. You know, something bad happens, they'll call it, you know, something, you know, Hooverville. Okay, and they blame for the suffering of the poor, and that's one of those cases here. All right, so the last thing I want to go over is something known as the bonus army. I'm going to give you a minute to write it down. This is going to lead into your period 2 assignment, which is a 4-question DBQ, not an essay, just a DBQ. I want to get some document practice. I think that'd be a good thing. And let's take a look at what this bonus army is, because this is a interesting situation. Okay, so this is one of those stories in American history. Like, I'm not 100% how the events transpired, but I could just go over like the basic details of it. But basically, after World War I, many soldiers were supposed to get were supposed to be given a bonus. If you guys know what a bonus is, if you ever have a job and you get a bonus, it's like extra payment for like a job well done. So many World War I veterans were severely struggling. And when the Great Depression hits, they particularly do very bad because a lot of them become unemployed, and a lot of them who, you know, once served our country to win World War I are now jobless. And one of the things was we wanted to try and take care of our veterans. They were promised bonuses after World War I, but never received them. So when they actually don't have money, they start to protest. And they went on what's called the Bonus Army March. And this took place in Washington, D.C. And they protested, and then eventually the Senate was in session in the U.S. Capitol. And while they're out marching, they refused to ratify the bill, giving them bonuses, because basically the government has no money. I mean, that's a long story short. They don't have much money, and they can't provide bonuses at this time. And this leads to a massive protest. And the protest eventually turned violent. This is where the discrepancy comes in, where I'm just not sure. So I'll tell you both sides. The military does get brought in to kind of control the situation, and the police get brought in to control the situation. It's a very tricky situation. You have over 40,000, I'm looking at the number now, over 40,000 World War I veterans protesting, and these veterans know how to fight. They're former soldiers. It's a very tricky situation because they're very, they're soldiers, so they know exactly how to fight. The U.S. military gets brought in to kind of control the situation, and some violence starts to break out. Now, this is the thing I don't know. I don't know who started the violence. All right, some say that the protesters, who turned rioters, started the violence. Some people say that, the military was brought in and they intensified the situation and they started the violence. But when the violence broke out, it became a pretty, rough thing. I think a couple of people ended up dying. I'm not going to say it's like the January 6th insurrection. I'm not going to say it was, as bad as that, but it was something similar looking. I guess that's the best way I can kind of say, because it was in Washington, D.C. It was around the Capitol, and it was over this issue of the this pension. Okay, so this was towards the end of Hoover's presidency, and this was like a big blemish on his record, because when you're not, quote unquote, taking care of the veterans, it becomes a not good situation. And in this case, it led to massive violence. Okay, and these riots became a huge issue in the American media. And obviously you can see photos here. That's not a great look when police officers and former soldiers are fighting. It's just not a good look. So the riots ensued, and the army was sent in to take them out, taking out a lot of the protesters. Now, the way I kind of have it written here was like maybe like, it was the rioters, the protesters here that it turned violent, but it's not necessarily the case. You could read it and interpret it both ways. So you guys are open to look at that any way you want. All right. With that being said, that's going to give you an opportunity now to go a little further in detail and look at the Bonus Army DBQ. So I'm just pulling that up for you here. Please just write in the chat the protocols for DBQ. I don't even know if I wrote them in here. So what are the protocols for DBQs? How do you answer these questions? Restate and quote. Okay, that's it. Don't have to do it like a big ELA assignment. Don't have to go to the text and then put an elaboration. Just restate, quote, RQ, very basic stuff. You will have like document 4 and document 5. You will have some pictures. So obviously you can't quote from a picture or a newspaper article, but like you can describe what's going on there. So that's also fine as well. This is due by the end of the day. This is your second period assignment. I don't think it should take you more than 20 minutes, to be honest. And we will go over the new president coming in after Hoover tomorrow and continue the Great Depression for Tuesday's class. All right, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you tomorrow. So long.